First of all, Father Ilya, I'm glad that you managed to join me in this conversation. And I'd like to emphasize the role of the Russian Orthodox Church for over 3 million Russians in the US, and how many of them are the second, third, or fourth generation of Russians, and how well they're connected with their country of the origin. Do they still have ties with Russia, or they became more or less integrated into the Western society?
Well, first of all, Stefan, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. And if you'd permit me, I'll start with the history of Russian presence in North America, and particularly in the United States. Well, it was first Russians came to the Northern Territories even before the United States have been formed. There are anecdotal accounts of Russian traders being or seeing the shores of Alaska as early as the mid-17th century, but there was nothing firm established until the end of the 18th century, which basically coincides with formation of the United States as the states. Most of the states, of course, were concentrated along the East Coast. Most of the West was still unexplored or belonged to the Crown of Spain. It was extension of Mexico all the way throughout Northern California, if not to say even further. And Russians pretty much expanded through Siberia, and conduct of Russians in Alaska was very much along as to what they did in Siberia and Far East. Mainly, it was establishing of the so-called factorias, the trade posts where they trade with natives, mainly in furs, exchanging whatever there were technological advances with local population in exchange for furs. Of course, there was no any kind of concept of mining at the time as far as gold concerned, which later would be found in great numbers, or any natural resources or anything of that nature. Alaska was very far from heartland of Russia. Travel to Alaska could take up to 2 years one way. So it was always territory somewhere beyond the frame of imagination. And even there was a concern about the people who were there. Russians were never very numerous. There was some government overseeing, but mainly people who were recruited to come to that far land colony were opportunists. Even at the beginning of 19th century, when Russians established themselves in Hawaii Islands, you know, it was more of a scare to the Russian government than anything else, because how in the world to support that? So Hawaii was sort of Russian for 2 years or 4 years, something of that nature. But again, it would be too far claim to say that Hawaii at any stretch of imaginations were Russian, so to say. Yeah. And to retain Alaska was very difficult. Even there was an attempt, as Russians were understood as protectors of the church, to send the mission to Alaska, which had a relative success. The most famous people would be Venerable Herman, a monk from Valam Monastery in what's today Finnish border, who went to Alaska and was really treating natives with great kindness and defending them from Russian tradesmen who really were rather abusive to the local population. Not all of them and not at all times, but the relations were very complex with intermittent wars and times of peace.
Yeah, like pioneers in the Wild West.
Yes, more or less.
The same concept of European
everywhere,
fortune,
you know, anywhere you look at,
all kinds of
yes, everywhere you look around the world, even like this huge swath of Siberia were conquered. It time-wise coincided with the Spanish conquest of Central and South America, more or less. Also, so very small numbers of people, you know, advancing into far lands, into far territories, and this territory is largely and still uninhabited until the last day. Of course, some local presence, some Russian presence, but it's really no point of discussing any numbers of the population. That's just great open land. So, and Alaska was even further. And again, this Saint Herman was his party of monks from Valam Monastery. Then there was Saint Innocent, who was a priest in Irkutsk diocese, which was very huge. When the bishop dies, he goes to St. Petersburg, spends there some time. Meanwhile, because of the plague, his wife and children are dying. He's ordained the bishop. He's sent to Irkutsk, but he does take care a great deal of the furthest remote regions of his diocese, which is Alaska. So the diocese in Alaska is established as well. But in 1867, the Russian government chooses on a free accord to sell Alaska off. Congress in the United States was mightily against that purchase because it was, again, great frozen land without much concept of profiteering from it. The Russians, nobody needed.
Yeah.
But Alaska was sold. There was a remaining Orthodox population, mainly among natives. United States government sent their missionaries because Orthodox were not understood as true Christians. Native children were taken to Presbyterian schools to be re-educated, an attempt to prevent them from native ways, but also from being Orthodox. And Alaskan Orthodoxy have this great flavor of ethnic impact because Orthodox, they're not only Aleutians, but they're Eskimos, but there are also Tlinkits and other Native American tribes that inhabit Alaska. So it's also a rather colorful presence. But Russians at the same time managed to send their priests for mission work all the way up to 1917. So they never gave up on idea of being there present, at least in the form of the church, even after Alaska was sold and formally was no longer Russian territory. But that part of the world still remain the edge of known civilization. Thus, when a future patriarch of Russia, Tikhon, is sent there in 1898, he moved the center of the Russian diocese first to San Francisco. By that time, California is already undergoing through big development, and then moving his episcopal center from West Coast to the East Coast to New York City. New York City more for, I'd say, if not business per se, but more of an active environment area. Although first seminary was established in Minneapolis, it did not last long there and it would eventually died out. But another seminary would be established in Scranton, Pennsylvania, named after St. Tikhon of Zadonsk, the patron of St. Tikhon. And St. Tikhon was very active in engagement with local Christians, and particularly Episcopalians, who were very friendly to the Orthodox at the time. And why he first moved from Alaska, because again, Alaska were backward. In San Francisco, there were enough of Russian immigrants, mainly who were present there for trades purposes. We're talking about before revolution. So Russian Far East is booming, California is booming. So there is a lot of connection. There was an idea to create a new San Francisco out of Vladivostok, because Russians were very impressed with how Americans were developing California, and Russian Far East is still greatly undeveloped, but there was an idea was building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, also of developing those far remote regions of the Russian Empire. But there were enough of Russians along the East Coast on the government service and the banking and the engineering services. There were enough of people who came for industrial exchange, Russia undergoing very rapid industrialization. So there is not enough technical professionals. They're coming to the United States to learn. But what is more important and very often oversighted, during that time, there is already conversion of uniates, and I'm going to say in a second who they are, into Orthodoxy.
Of course.
As you know, the main or major players in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century were, of course, German Reich, Russian Empire, British Empire, but also Austro-Hungarian Empire.
True.
And majority of Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was the probably most Slavic empire after the Russian Empire.
True. And very Roman Catholic empire.
And very Roman Catholic.
Yes.
and it occupied parts of what's today Poland and Republic of Czechia and Slovakia, and of course Hungary and parts of Serbia and Croatia and such.
Absolutely.
So there was big contingent on the eastern border of Austria-Hungary of Slavs, who since the very late 16th century were converted to Catholicism. Although the conversion was of rather soft form, they were allowed to maintain Eastern Rite. They're called Eastern Rite Catholics, but formally they were under the auspices of Pope. And these people, there were Slovaks, there were Ukrainians, there were what's today Belarusians, but also some smaller sub-nations or nations of Rusins, of Lemkos and such. Those people who inhabited Carpathian Mountains and slopes of the east and on the west of Carpathian Mountains, but who never had proper formed statehood or ethnic identity, and who historically were, as part of the developing Eastern European Slavs, so to become known as Russians or Ukrainians, there was no much division between the people at the time. There were various dukedoms, not, part of the Kievan Rus, but then ever since the death of Vladimir, there was big division and confrontation. So they somehow fall within the Western Dominion, retaining their orthodoxy in the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, where majority were in fact Orthodox. Even the hierarchy and higher ups, aristocrats were Catholics. Majority of the population were Orthodox and lived relatively unhindered. But after Union of Brest in 1596, most of the peasants and local population were converted to Catholicism, or it was much harder for them to retain their Orthodox identity, although the accommodation was made that they could maintain the Eastern Rite, but minor alterations.
We have similar situation in the Middle East, namely Jordan.
Right.
Where
exactly.
We have more maybe unions than classical Roman Catholics.
Right. So same as in Lebanon and Syria and Armenia and such.
True.
So, but when these people, because their life in Austro-Hungarian Empire was very difficult, and they seek to improve their life, they were started coming in great numbers to the United States and Canada, mainly to the United States, settling along the eastern shore for the most part, working in the coal mines, which was the most labor-intensive employment. Yes, thank you for the word. But at the same time, did not necessarily require much of the language skills or any professional skills. They were all peasants and not educated at all. Or settling in the Midwest, and particularly in Minneapolis, where people from Scandinavia were settling at this time. That's why there was a great number of them along this Canadian border above Chicago. But for the most part, with very few exceptions, the triangle, say Minneapolis, Washington, Boston, that was the East Coast where most of the, generally speaking, Rusins or Slovaks have settled. And of course, as people who were very pious, they tried to establish their communities, but local Roman Catholics did not accept them at all. And the point of conflict came especially over the married clergy, which was quite scandalous to Roman Catholics. And proud people say, well, then we're going back to our mother church, we're becoming Orthodox. And there was mass conversion, tens of thousands of people who rejoined the Orthodox Church. And it's actually because of them, this Archbishop Tikhon, future patriarch of Russia, first after the Romanovs, because under the Peter, Russian patriarchate was dismissed, suppressed by the Synod with a military officer as it had, as Ober Procurator. So, but after the revolution, there was a Synod and Council of the Russian Church that elected patriarch. So that very bishop who was active for 10 years in the United States, he would be elected patriarch. But it's unrelated to our story this time, except that he was very active in receiving these people back to Orthodox, establishing the seminary. And as the Russian church largely paid for many of the bills of the Orthodox in the United States, these people profess themselves Russians without being such, and they were in many ways Russified, and many churches were built with very Russian flavor and identity. So many of the people who don't even speak Russian, and I live in the United States for almost 25 years, and I know some of my older parishioners, their grandparents came to this country, but they still retain the language, and they try to talk to me, and I wouldn't understand them necessarily very well. And they would challenge me saying, well, what kind of Russian you are? And then they say, of course, we're peasants, and you must be from the big city. That's why you don't understand us. But reality behind it is, of course, they spoke more of a Slovak language than Russian, which is not good or bad. It's just the reality behind it. Fact. Yes, and clergy were supplied from Russia. Some of them came on temporary basis. Some came and stood here for a while. Of course, assignment to Russian Alaska or even to mainland United States was not necessarily something that people greatly desired or were eager if they could find the way to provide for themselves back home. And then when revolution struck, everything all of a sudden abruptly changed. First of all, imperial government was no longer able, naturally, there was no imperial government anymore, to pay the bills for the for the Russian church here. Nor they were able to be protectors of the local Orthodox who started to come to the United States, because, for instance, Arabs were great benefactors of the Russian presence in the United States. They started to come right around World War I, maybe just a little bit before it, in great numbers. And of course, as the result of the disintegration turmoil of World War I, there were more Orthodox coming from all over the place. Greeks were already in the United States, but more of them came after the exchange of population, 1922, 1923. At the same time, Serbs started to come in greater numbers, a bit of Bulgarians, even a bit of Christian Orthodox Albanians, and was bringing more ethnic diversity, and without Russians being able to pay for bills, we see the beginning of expat Orthodox jurisdictions in the United States. Serbs had their own church, Bulgars had their own church, Arabs their own, Greek their own, and so on and so forth. So Russians were facing the dilemma, because you have this great contingent of Slovaks, you do have some Russians, not too many immigrants from Russian Empire came to the United States as they came to Europe. First Turkey, then Serbia, then Germany, France.
At that time it was Yugoslavia, Kingdom of Yugoslavia,
right? Yeah, well, you know, they were welcomed, but United States, you know, many Russians settled in China, where there was big Russian presence even before revolution. Some Russians did come to the United States, but not as many. In fact, many of Russians who did come to the United States had some connections in the US prior to revolution, whether through work connections, who were working in the banking industry, who were working in the technical industry. Of course, there were some refugees, but not quite as many as in the in European countries. And hence there was a birth of Russian metropolia that was semi-autonomous. And Metropolitan Platon was ahead of it, and he faced a very grim dilemma. First of all, how to organize the life of the church. Majority of the parishes were very poor, so they could not provide really neither for building programs, not for the clergy. Second, any and all connections with Russia was greatly jeopardized, because naturally Soviets wanted to control any expatriates and clergy and everything else. And Metropolitan Sergius, who was moved to be the head of the church after likely assassinated Patriarch Tikhon, and in time when all of his lawful successors have been arrested. Metropolitan Sergius, you know, he is a very tragic figure, but likely he was a conscious collaborant for whatever reason, for reason of self-survival, or thinking of by that saving the church is a very long issue, and with not all of the archives is still available. It's still subject for debate, but largely he's still seen as a negative entity. He was demanding clergy to submit to himself and to express loyalty to the state, just as he did express loyalty on behalf of the Russian church to the communists. So groups of Russians in Europe, of so-called Paris Exarchate, Russian metropolia in the United States, and Russian Synod in exile that was formed of the bishops and clergy who ran away after the revolution as a result of civil war. They refused to do so. They absolutely refused to do so. That Synod of Russian bishops that in exile that was formed in Sremski Karlovci in Yugoslavia, they demanded Metropolitan Evlogy Gergievsky in Paris and Metropolitan Platon in the United States to submit to the authority. They said that they are rightly heir to of the Russian Orthodox Church, but unfortunately all three hierarchs were not only very well educated, not very charismatic, not only people who exude great authority, but also, said to say, arrogant and self-made people. And it was impossible for all three to reconcile. So you had not one, but three Russian churches in exile, which of course only one with a synod in Sremski Karlovci was called such, but there was a Paris Exarchate that eventually would find its way under the auspice of Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. And another, perhaps the largest of them all, Russian metropolia in the United States, was became semi-independent entity. There were some Russian parishes, few, not many, that tried to show its loyalty to the church in Russia, even under the Soviet government, not without conflicts. And there were some parishes who joined this Russian Synod in exile, but they were not very numerous in the United States. And in 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that Russian metropolia that consists overwhelmingly largely of that Slovak population or Carpatho-Russian population, Rusin population, it maintained its independency. And there would be attempt to reconcile with the Russian church in exile from Sremski Karlovci that moved to Berlin and then, escaping the Soviet army, of course, moved to the United States, to reconcile, but agendas were just simply too different. In America, those were already second, third generation of the people who didn't have particular affinity for the Red Russians. So, life of the parishes was very difficult, and at times people were prosecuted because they were called Russians, and Russians could be only communists. In fact, a parish where I served in upstate New York, and this little town was one of the hubs of KKK, and crosses were burned in front of the church.
Yeah, like in fact, that's African Americans, not Indo-Europeans.
Yes, but they were viewed as communists. They were viewed as communists.
That's like a communist infiltration of the U.S. according to these.
Yes, even they came before revolution. They had no connection to Russia or Russian Empire, even for that matter. In fact, that's why most Orthodox parishes here have American flags inside the church. When I came to United States, I was shocked because I never seen a flag being exhibited in the church. And I was very much against that practice, not to say that I had something against the United States, but we're citizens of heavenly Jerusalem first and foremost. And it took some time to realize that its flag served a very particular purpose.
True.
it's a demonstration not of loyalty, but it's demonstration of a very particular status quo non-aggressiveness.
Yeah,
it is almost it's almost as defense. It's a snapshot of human tragedy of what was happening in 1920s and 1930s, actually.
Yeah, at that time KKK was very strong in the US.
Yes. And Slavs who came even after Irish were frowned upon. You know, if to be a Catholic was not the thing for the longest time, to be Eastern Slav, you know, was really dreadful.
Why they had the animosity over Eastern Slavs?
Well, I don't think it's in particular the Slavs. I think it's the animosity that is passed down the line. Whoever comes first have the upper hand. Whoever comes after that is frowned upon and looked upon, until they'll be integrated in the society. So I wouldn't say that it was in particular Slavic connection. I'm thinking it was because of the revolution and communist threat more than anything. That's how it was perceived.
Mm-hmm. So it's probably
another
the same,
thing is
probably it's the similar situation when these half-wits attacked Sikhs and Greeks, thinking that they are Arabs and automatically terrorists after 9/11.
Well, Arabs not viewed greatly. I mean, you know, now of course, politically correctness rule, but a concept that people from Egypt could be Christians or people from Syria could be Christian, you know, raise a lot of eyebrows. But I have to say, it's not only in America. When I discuss it, especially with younger generation, and talking that I'm going to see Christian sites in Jordan, or how important is historical impact of Northern African Christianity in places like Libya and Tunisia and Algeria, people raise eyebrows saying, wait a minute, those are Muslim countries. I said, well, what was happening before Islam came there?
True.
You know, that's the thing, and we know very little about it. So even when history is taught, you know, when I went to school, of course, we studied history of what's called Russia, starting with Kiev and Rus. I mean, today it's Ukraine, Belarus, Russia.
Of course, we have these.
But
we have these instant nations that were formed in the last 60, 70 years. But you know what's my general opinion about that?
Yes, but the thing is that we studied it because we're from there. But most of the study course is what? Antiquity, Egypt, you know, maybe Babylonia a little bit, then Greece, Rome, and then Western Europe.
True.
We knew about Western Europe as a cradle of civilization much more than we knew about anything. Everything else was mentioned in a passerby way. Byzantium, what's Byzantium, you know? Even about Islamic kingdoms, what do we know?
True.
It's very superficial.
It's very superficial, and it's very Eurocentric in a way, or West Eurocentric, to be more
right.
Precise,
so, but
West Eurocentric.
Let me forgive me if I'm making my introduction too long. I'll just
no. It's not too long, and it's very interesting conversation. Please go ahead. We don't have any time frame.
Okay, so the synod of this Russian Church in Exile moves from Berlin or from Germany and from Serbia to United States. And what else is happening simultaneously is that there was a lot of DPs or displaced persons who move from Europe to the United States as well, trying to escape Soviet army or trying to escape being turned back to the Soviets. As you perhaps know, Soviet Union had the greatest number by far of the prisoners of war in German camps, who were horribly mistreated, treated pretty much like Jews, exterminated in great numbers, because Stalin refused to sign the Red Cross Treaty. He said that Soviet Union has no prisoners of war, it has traitors. And there were many people who were taken to Germany for labor, not necessarily labor camps per se, but labor camps as well, but to be used as house slaves, house serfs in the German households. Of course, growing up in the Soviet Union, I read about these horrors exclusively from one perspective, as how young girls would be grabbed on the street and thrown like cattle into the train and transported to Germany and everything else. But here in the United States, I met some of these people who were taken as prisoners of war and used for labors. And many of them actually remembered their German captivity as a step up of improvement of their life in comparison to how they lived supposedly free in the USSR before the war, even as children, what they could remember. Of course, it's not a universal example, and there are German policy towards Slavs was not kind. It was policy really of scourge, earth, and extermination. But there was a human element where some of the people who were accommodated to the household were taken literally as family members, and treated very nicely. And even they had to do the work, their quote unquote masters, they were not treated as slaves. They may have status of semi-slaves, but they had liberty to go out. They were rewarded, clothing would be put, they would be given private rooms and such. I'm not saying that's ideal circumstance, but there was, in many occasions, great humanity behind it as well. And
of course,
what
it's
happened?
Not black and white. People
no, it's not black and white. It's much more complicated.
It's much more complicated and complex.
It's much more complicated. But why I'm saying that to me it was a revelation. To me it was absolute revelation. Revelation was, and this is extremely contentious and controversial point of view, to meet people who became as what was described as collaborators, conscience collaborators. Of course, almost all of them inescapably came from German concentration camps. Those were soldiers who were taken prisoners under the most grievous circumstances, not having any food for weeks on, not having ammunition. Very many of them were wounded. And many of them came out of the environment where they could not remember anything about communists kindly. There were people from the villages or from the cities, family members of whom were arrested or disappeared during the communist purges, their livelihoods completely destroyed, and they were not great sympathizers with communist rule. And when the opportunity presented itself as what they saw to throw their lot with Germans in attempt to overthrow the communist regime, they did join the Germans. But again, it's also not black and white, because most of them never fought. Germans did not trust them.
So maybe you're talking about, are you talking about General Vlasov and his
yes,
Russian
but
army?
General Vlasov, yes, General Vlasov, you see, when we're talking about General Vlasov and the Russian Liberation Army, there is a lot of things thrown in to something that didn't belong to him. For instance, there were Cossacks and Russian Expeditionary Corpus that was hunting red partisans and Chetniks in Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
There were with SS forces, they were not part of the Vlasov army. There were soldiers who tried to help Germans to suppress the uprising in Warsaw Ghetto. True. And they were consisted mainly of criminal elements who came from the Soviet Union. There were various ethnic divisions within the German army who, in protest of the suppression under the Soviets, joined the SS forces as well. They all were given to General Vlasov in April of 1945, and his name was marred by when the war was over, and when his actions really, it was all thrown into the melting pot, and all the atrocities that these people did were put and given association with his name. In fact, again, I'm not trying to justify any actions. I'm just trying to explain the human element. For instance, very few people knew that Prague was liberated not by the Red Army, but by the corpus of General Vlasov. The only major military conflict was Russian soldiers in German military uniform fighting the very German forces in Prague, which, again, quite scandalous. You left Russians just to wear German uniforms to fight Germans. So even that many of them were turned back to the Soviet army and ended up in gulags, some of them managed to escape, and some of them were allowed to come to the United States. Of course, there was many tragics where Russians or former Soviet citizens were turned back even when they arrived to New Jersey, and they were sent back, and many of them perished. Why I mention prisoners of war? Because on many occasions, prisoners of war who were in German camps were transferred to Soviet gulags and perished there. They were all considered as traitors.
True.
They're all considered as traitors. So when the Synod of Russian Church in Exile came here, pretty much in parallel with this displaced persons, they attempted to talk with Russian Metropolia, but negotiations have failed, and they established themselves here in the United States. And most of the now ethnic Russians who came, they joined the Synod because it had expressly Russian identity. Even the Metropolis still served in Russian. The spirit of it was not Russian enough. And the Synod saw itself as an offshoot of the Russian, great Russian Orthodox legacy. And they established here a parallel hierarchy. Of course, they saw that Metropolia should be under them as well, but they were not. So we have two Russian jurisdictions in one place, both in the United States, to less degree in Canada as well. Russians after war also immigrated to Central and South America. There are hardly any of them left there, but there were places in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Mexico. Not many, but some. And situation continued like that in parallel existence with no relation to each other and with no relation to Moscow, all the way up 1970, where in attempt to unify Orthodox in the United States and Canada, and in attempt to bring more canonical order, where there would be no more than one bishop in one city and everything else, there were big negotiations between the heads of the Orthodox diaspora as to how to establish one Orthodox church in the United States. More or less ethnic, it's not as far as ethnicity, but as far as locality, one Orthodox church. And the position of one of the most numerous, still relatively tiny in comparison to the population, but still one of the most numerous jurisdictions, that Metropolia, since there was no desire to go under the Moscow Patriarchy that was controlled by the authorities, to establish some kind of credibility. And negotiations went, and Moscow Patriarchate gave autocephaly or self-governance to the Metropolia of Russian parishes in the United States. However, ecumenical patriarchate and Greek churches never recognize it. Nature behind it is, of course, that Constantinople believed that it's prerogative only of ecumenical patriarchs to give autocephaly, that no any other church could grant autocephaly. Another thing is that Moscow Patriarchate did it unilaterally. And thirdly, that of course, if all of the churches would recognize autocephaly of the American church, that would mean that they would have to give up on their parishes, and it has to be one church, right? Because you could not be present on the canonical territory of the other jurisdiction. You know, it has to be one governance. So hence, in 1970, the Russian church, the Russian Metropolia became Orthodox Church in America. Orthodox Church in America, that is in communion with all the other Orthodox churches, but at the same time, its autocephaly is not recognized by all, and it consists, I'd say, nowadays mainly of 40 to 50% of descendants of the Slovaks who came from
Galicia,
from Austro-Hungary, and about 40-50% converts. Maybe I won't be able to give you exact percentage, and I'm taking my word back, because that in 1970, some Romanian parishes joined in, some Bulgarian parishes joined in, some Albanian parishes joined in. Of course, you have parishes with ethnic population in Alaska as well. You have some parishes in Mexico as well, but they're relatively few. So majority bulks are Rusyns and converts, former Protestants, agnostics, Catholics who joined the Orthodox faith. And there are some Russians who came in later period of time, although Russians tend to gravitate mainly to this Russian Orthodox Church in exile or Okor, because they're professedly much more Russian than most of the parishes in Metropolia. So dynamics have changed in 1990s. There was some immigrants coming in late 1970s and 1980s, dissidents, but majority were not ethnic Russians, but Jews. But because they were Russified Jews, many of them actually converted to Christianity.
We do many of them, of course, didn't profess Judaism. True.
Yes, the ones that did not retain the Jewish identity.
True.
And we do have a number of clergy in Metropolia who actually, and a church in exile as well, who may be ethnic Jews, but neither their parents or maybe even grandparents ever went to synagogue. And so by culture, they're very much Russian, Soviet, whatever. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, this new Russian identity and what it is, and if there is such a thing. So, and of course, the greater wave of immigration started to come in 1990s. There were, somebody say, between 1 million and 2 million of people who came from the Soviet Union, but all of them were known as Russian. All of them were known as Russian, and ethnically they may not necessarily be Russian. We didn't have too much population who immigrated from Central Asia or from Caucasus, who even by the looks don't look very Slavic at all.
True.
And I'm not talking about racial division, but I'm talking about different language,
different culture. Of course, many of them look typically Caucasian.
So, yeah, Soviet Union had over 150 nationalities.
True.
And so many cultures, but they all commonly known as they came from Soviet Union as Russians. Russians, like Jews in Israel by Arabs are called Russians and not even called Jews, right? They're called Russian. Oh, we don't have any Russians. They're not Russians, they're Jews, but they're known as Russians. That's the outsider perspective on them. And some of them came to church, and in fact, that new mass wave of immigration led to the reunification of Russian Synodal Church with Moscow Patriarchate. Autocephalous Church remained Autocephalous Church, and now relation more or less normalized with Moscow. It was always very good, and with Synod in past decade, a little over a decade since the reunification, relations normalized as well. But those Russians who do go to church, they spread more or less evenly based on which parish in which city there is, where there is used more ethnic vernacular language and such. So they don't necessarily have preference. And at this point, I wanted to talk a little bit about general Slavic experience,
please,
and in particular Russian experience in the United States. Unlike Greeks, unlike Arabs, unlike Jews, who were more tied into the Jewish communities, Slavs do not maintain their ethnic identity very well or very long, and Russians in particular. Those who were here before revolution and came after the revolution, we could safely say that their grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren still retain their ethnic identity.
Yeah.
They overall be, generally speaking, able to speak the language, read and write, know somewhat of Russian history, culture, and even if they may use more English in their daily life, they would still be associating themselves with Russian legacy. those people who came after World War II, I would say their children and at best grandchildren maintain their Russian identity, although they were first generation of Soviet people. Those people who came after World War II, those were people who were already born under the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And those people who came in 1990s, they do preserve their identity the worst. We could say that already there.
That's strange. Because they're the new, they should have, please.
Yes, their children already, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, speak English. There is no emphasis on anything ethnic. And even if women still cooking general Soviet dishes, such as ruska salata and borscht and things of that nature, and men heatedly debate each other as who is pro-Putin and who is against Putin. At the same time, on the very basic level, they losing their identity very rapidly, very, very rapidly. With few exceptions, overall, there is no desire to preserve the identity. I'm thinking the key to it is that unfortunately, there is no Russian identity anymore. There is no Russian identity anymore. Russians as ethnicity were used as the flame material in creation of a new man under the Soviets. If ethnic periphery of the empire, Baltics, parts of Western Ukraine was annexed by the Soviet Union later, so most of the hotbed of Ukrainian identity comes from there, same with Belarus. Caucasian republics, they had their enclaves. Russianhood was completely expanded. And not to minimize the tragic of ethnic suffering in the USSR of any of those above mentioned nations, Russians on one hand were the most numerous, but they lost the most. I'm thinking 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we could safely say, and I'm saying that this was great sadness as a historian, as the lover of my motherland and everything else, that for the most part, Russians are no more. We have a post-Soviet amalgamation that considers itself Russian, but really has very little to do with Russian heritage. Don't forget that before revolution, majority of the population in Russian Empire were semi-serfs. They were just recently liberated peasants, people who are not very well educated, and people who did not, who were the, how shall I say, the keepers of this folk tradition, but at the same time, the livelihood was dreadful. Those small part of the elite and refined Russian intellectuals,
they were foreigners.
Lovers of history
many
and
of
culture.
Them were non-Russians.
Many of them were non-Russians, but there were many Germans who became more Russians than Russians, like great, right? So what happened after revolution, that this educated elite, whether either exterminated or immigrated.
True.
And Soviets wanted to create a very cosmopolitan idea of a Soviet man, where there is going to be no religion, no ethnicity, no nothing. It's all going to be shoved, and it's mainly the Russian village that gave the source for what? For rapid industrialization. And people who moved from the villages to cities, they lost their sense of identity. You know, those cultures that remain, that preserved agricultural element the longest, they maintain their ethnic traditions. When you're talking to population from urban environment, they are very much cosmopolitan. They don't retain, on the whole, their identity. So where there is no connection to the ground, to the earth, so to say, to the folk tradition, that disappears very quickly. And look what's in Russia, in a heartbed, in a heartland of Russia. You go from St. Petersburg to Moscow, you hardly could see any lights along the roads if you're traveling by night. Russia, heartland of Russia is no more. So-called these regions of historical let it be Novgorod, Pskov, or Vladimir, or Tver, or anything else, completely depopulated. There is no any agriculture to speak of. Even small towns that were still functioning under the Soviets and where there were some factories or whatever that give people some place to work, they're completely disintegrating. The level of living is absolutely horrendous. It's worse than in third world country. So people are flocking to larger cities. And phenomenon of destruction of the village, of course, it started with collectivization in 1930s. And it was another devastating blow was World War II, where so many men have died. And the living conditions after World War II were so bad that peasants were not even given passports because you needed to have registration. It was a new passport, and passport was kept by the leader, the president, the director of this collective farm.
Of course, of kolkhoz.
It led, kolkhoz. Yes. So it led to the reality where young boys who would be drafted in the army, and they would get their passport there, they would never come back. They would go into the city and became city proletariat, just not to go back and not to be virtually a prisoner. And young girls, they would be pushed to relatives who already lived in the cities, again, just not to talk back, to turn 16 in the city in order to get that passport and to get the registration in the city. Hence, absolute collapse in the village in 1970s and 1980s, shortage of food, very disbalanced economy, plus Russian heartland universally lays in the territory what's called not even stable, but dangerous agriculture, because weather is unpredictable and you can't grow much. Nowadays, with good organization, Russia doesn't have to have shortage of food. It's exporting wheat and other food again because of the technological development in the southern regions of Russia. Voronezh, Belgorod, and further south, Rostov-on-Don, you don't need that much land to grow enough food or sufficient food for the population. Mm-hmm. So it's much more intense, but with the equipment, it's very much manageable. So
you don't need population there, of course.
You don't need population, but at the same time, that's where Russians or Russian nation were born.
Of course.
And it's no more. It's no more. I invite you to travel to Russia when there is going to be a chance to see what's yet left.
True.
Because regardless of very triumphant and very propagandistic reports, outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg and a handful of rather large cities, traditional Russia is dramatically suffering. It's not only beyond repair, it's virtually no more. And I'm talking, as a person whose parents is from that very region. I know it very intimately. I traveled and I have many associations, still some relatives left. It's human tragedy. So people who immigrated to the United States and who came from this very cosmopolitan environment, they had very little connection to cultural trends. And if you universal Russian or universal Soviet, just speaking Russian language, what is culture? Just some food? You don't know songs, you don't know traditions, you don't know history. What does it matter?
True.
You can have shish kebab outside New York, on dacha. Yes. You purchase a little house in Poconos in Pennsylvania, you can have your shish kebab there. Children would play Nintendo games or whatever, computer games, speak with English contemporaries, and they'd become American. Just as there are trends in Russia right now. Do children have that much impact? Do they emphasize the ethnic upbringing? What are you surrounded with? It looks very much like a silly thing. Again, I understand the trend, but it's still, it's very painful to me. But hence, that's the reality. Last wave of Russians who started to come to the United States started to come after 2014. After 2014, after the conflict in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, because situation in the country turned to being more controlling, and courts are less independent. It's much harder to maintain business, and many of the people who didn't want to lose an opportunity, they started to move to the United States. They would not necessarily were thinking of immigration because they already established themselves well in modern Russia, but because of the political uneasiness, they started to come, but they come already with a lot of finances, with very good education, and they're settling close, there are a lot of Russians in Silicon Valley, in California, not only programmers, but also entrepreneurs, people who could invest and such, but they work all over the world pretty much. You could be from India, from China, from Israel, from Gulf countries, doesn't matter, many places. And Russians are not exempt, but it's again the internal politics that actually drove them away. They're not necessarily involved in politics, but they knew that politics can hunting them down. And they don't want that. They don't want to choose sides. So they are more or less caring about what are they doing, and they want to do it in a free environment. And I'm not necessarily ready to point finger at them and to say, well, you're not patriotic. Because when you could work and live for science, I had many parishioners, professors at the universities who came and they said, we'd love to work in Russia, but there were just simply no real opportunities because, science really not invested in. You have better opportunity to use your brains for general good. I'm not talking about anything that could be interpreted in military or engineering things, but even that, but medicine, biology, chemistry, applied sciences, humanities. I lament the loss by Russia of those specialists. But so
it's another brain drain. It's another
brain drain, which unfortunately was created by very unwise internal politics, really. They didn't live because of the protests, they lost because of inability to be used in a good sense. Because of this crisis of identity, I have to say, not too many people are coming to church. It's very hard to estimate. It's very hard to estimate as to really how many people are not immigrated to the United States. How many of them ethnic Russians or potential ethnic Orthodox? There is, statistics are a very tricky thing.
Of course.
When I see saying that Russian Orthodox Church has 150 million people, whom do you count in?
Of course.
Is it entire population of Russia? Or is it those who belong to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine and Belarus? How do you count that? Because, for instance, in Russia, majority of Russians consider themselves Orthodox, but you could not call all 140 million Russians Orthodox because 140 million is a total population, not all of them Russian. And among those, there is like 15 or 20 million Muslims.
True.
So there goes the statistics. Even about 70% of those who consider themselves ethnic Russians, they consider themselves Orthodox. Only a small fraction of those say that they have something to do with church. Orthodox identity is part of what they perceived as Russian identity. Some of those people who say that they're Orthodox haven't been even baptized. They have no plan of getting baptized.
So they're not Orthodox. You cannot call them Orthodox, of course.
No, but again, it's one statistic is, are you Orthodox? Yes. How often do you go to church? I don't. Have you been baptized? No. Are you planning to get baptized? No.
Of course.
So
we have similar statistics. We have similar statistics in my part of the world regarding Muslims. So they count all ethnic and religious groups as Muslims instead of fragmenting the population and saying percentage-wise, how many of them are Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholics, Sunni Muslim, Shiite Muslims. And of course, in places like Crimea, you have a significant Muslim population.
Right, Caucasus, you know,
Or
Tatars
or
lived in Volga region.
Yes.
Right. So the thing is, and same applies here. You know, same applies here. Greek archdiocese recently has been by far more transparent than before, and I'm thinking claims dropped from 2 million Greeks, 2 million Orthodox Greeks to 400,000, and now to maybe a quarter of that.
Wow.
Because if you count those who really come to church and practice the faith versus those who may be ethnically Greeks or who are descendants of the Greeks who have nothing to do with Greek identities. They may have Greek last name, but that's the extension of their Greek connection.
True.
But why I'm saying that, because they're a little bit better with statistics than we are, not to put anybody down. And the trend is the same. Since in diaspora, language and culture gradually being lost, the use of vernacular language, for which all the population fight tooth and nail, serves a great disservice. Young people become very disinterested in the service because they could not understand what's going on, let alone that it's not just simple language, because you have singing, you have chanting, you have ceremony, it's boring, it's not understandable, it's this and that. And they stopped being interested. Usually if there is interest, it's renewed interest post-college years or because of the great efforts of the parents. But very few maintain their identity all throughout. And actually, I'm very proud of Metropolia that I belong to, this Orthodox Church in America. Even I'm being ethnic Russian, I'm obviously speaking with an accent, that the right emphasis was put on the language, maybe too late, but nevertheless, it was more so than in any other jurisdiction. Second one comes Antiochian Archdiocese, which was even to a greater degree anglicized, and they have even more converts than we had. But with recent events in the Middle East, there is again mass influx of Arab-speaking people, and there is a reversal trend where American clergy who are no Arabs by any stretch of imagination now have to learn some Arabic, because fully English parishes all of a sudden became refuge to people who had to flee from Syria, from Lebanon, from Iraq, and from other parts of the Middle East. Right. So there was a similar trend in American parishes here, especially around New York City, where Russians became overwhelming majority, but we're still talking about fraction of a percent of the people who really attending. The most famous Russian enclave that is really Jewish enclave, not Russian, but still there are many Russian speakers. Brighton Beach in New York. Brighton Beach in New York, where there are numerous parishes, only small percentage of people coming. There are maybe 4 or 5 parishes with attendance of maybe 100, 200 people. And it's from among between 100 and 200,000 Russian speakers residing in the immediate area. So it's a very small percentage. People would come, they would baptize their child without knowing what's that, and the thinking of their, Russian culture and such. Over here in the United States, there is understanding of parish membership. You need to have a conscious understanding that you're responsible for the luck of your community. You need to pay for the building, you need to pay for utilities. Priest gets a bit of a salary, stipend and place to live. So it's a responsibility. It's not only buying a candle or maybe giving a contribution for wedding or funeral. In Russia, it is like that. Churches very often turned into the kiosk for selling jewelry or something of that nature, because there is no concept of donation or tithing or things of those are sponsors with a lot of money who support parishes. Or before COVID, now that unhealthy relation is greatly shaken. Over here, you lived according to your means. You know how many people come to your parish. You know what the budget is. You have annual meeting where all the finances are discussed. It's all very transparent, and we see what can we do next year, what should we do, what should we cut, or can we expand, can we do repairs, things of that nature. And very often priests have to work because communities are not very large, and religious life overall across the spectrum of religious life in the United States is dwindling. So it becomes harder and harder to make ends meet. I, for instance, lead groups, organize pilgrimages, art, archaeological trips to Europe, to Russia, to the Middle East, to Jordan, for instance.
Yes.
One of my really favorite places out of all the places that I have been to. Jordan really have special place in my heart, and I say that not because you are in Amman right now, but because it's true.
It's a very significant location for Christianity in general.
Yes,
but
just overall legacy, and I had met so many wonderful people there whom I consider my very dear acquaintances and friends, and I've been to the house of Jordanian people and treated very nicely. So it does have a special place with me. So, but again, in addition to my pastoral duties, I need to think how to provide for my family. So there are some priests who work, some work as truck drivers, other works as lawyers and doctors and such. So, but Russians, when they come, and again, by Russians at this point, I meant anybody who came from the former Soviet Union. I myself am from Latvia, of Russian extraction, but from Latvia, a small, tiny republic on the Baltic coast. But I'm just part of that general trend. So it's a very interesting thing that, yes, there are newspapers that are published in Russian, there is Russian TV, there are plenty of Russian stores where you can buy Russian food. Curiously enough, I live in a relatively small city in upstate New York, and majority of our Russian speakers, they're oddly enough Protestants from Ukraine for the most part. But we maintain here very good and cordial relations, and there is it's called Russian, well, it's not called Russian food store, but it's still called Russian food. And of course, people who come there, all Eastern Europeans, and not Russians necessarily, but we have some delicacies, so it all ends up with food and food identity, especially around the holidays. So you buy your sausages, you buy your cheese, you buy your milk products,
or pickled vegetables.
Pickled vegetables and such. So you and various there are delis and confectionaries and various pastry shops in Philadelphia, in New York, and New Jersey in particular, where they produce a lot. They buy local products, but they produce pretty much the same stuff that we grew up with. Even, Soviets were not very good with acknowledging the copyrights. So at times you buy same exact candy that you could buy in Russia and that you grew up with, except it says manufactured in New York. So you think, oh, it's an export. No, it's actually a local product, but it looks exactly identical to what it was there. So, but it's interesting dynamics. Religion-wise, Eastern Europe, I'm thinking now we could say safely, unfortunately, is less religious than Western Europe. With all the collapse of Western Christianity as we see it, proportion-wise, statistic-wise, and Pew Research is a great source for it. There are notable exceptions, like say Poland or Hungary or Romania, but overall religiosity and practice of Christianity in Eastern Europe is even less than in Western Europe. And the fact that, say, in Russia, there are many churches being built and monasteries restored, it's the storefront of attempt of identity revival in past 30 years, but it comes to a halt. Tradition was broken, and now we need to work with people. An emphasis of preaching, emphasis of mission work among the population was not done. It was a dream of lost empire, all was black and white. Now we're going to fix it, but time move on. So now you have many beautiful churches that stay empty or virtually empty, and even they're filled, what is the percentage of population that fill them? So it's very tragic attempt at reviving the church life in a sense of maybe addressing the issues of liturgics or issues of fasting or issues of conduct. It was no, we need to maintain it. 100 years ago, during the All Russian Council, where Patriarch Tikhon, who worked so zealously here in the United States, was elected patriarch, all of those issues have been addressed and proven that they're not working for population that was by far more religious, more educated, more pious than people now. But even nowadays, when we have issues which sounds to many as completely artificial, liturgical language, calendar, those viewed as big things that defining us as Orthodox, completely forgetting what the gospel is all about. You know, people, there is maybe an excuse for it, but nevertheless, they holding to the tradition as it defining their Christianity in times when gospel has very little impact on their day-to-day conduct. And to me, it's the only way to survive, because if people would be conscious of who they are, they certainly would try to raise their children in such way, and they certainly would try to maintain that identity and build the churches and fill the churches and such. But you need to try to preserve an artificial form. Artificial why? Not because it had no place in history, but has no meaning or understanding to a modern man. It's big, like a club of reenactors. At least if you pretending to be a Viking or Crusader, you have to make conscious decision, because you have to buy ammunition and you have to do it on your spare time, and you need to have an investment.
True.
But when somebody else tells you, well, you have to do it, and you say why, and you say, well, you have to.
True, you don't question this. You don't question.
Yes, but when you question it, and all of a sudden it begins a variety of scenarios are possible, you say, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Right?
Yeah.
So that's the complexity. That's the complexity, and all of that, of course, transplanted from the east part of the Atlantic here. So we're dealing with the same things here.
So according to you, the problem is with the motherland and the way they practice Orthodox Christianity. If they're more into faith, embedded into the faith, it would affect diaspora much more, and you would have a different situation.
Absolutely. I can give you an example. I did have some Russians who, when I came to my first parish in Buffalo, it was about 50-50, 50% English, 50% Russian, language-wise.
Yeah,
I'm not talking ethnicity-wise or anything else. And of course, I was viewed by English party as a threat because I'm Russian. So naturally, I have to align myself with Russians. And that was source of the division within this parish for decades. And I choose very Anglo line because I knew that I could talk to quote unquote Russians as my own people and they would understand me, but I needed to not alienate my English part of the parish. Otherwise my parish would be divided. Besides, even among Russians, their children, we talk about old Russians, they spoke English and they didn't come to church. So introducing more English in the services would bring them back. But what I found very strange and very interesting is that new Russian immigrants who spoke Russian at home, spoke Russian to me, they actually welcomed English during the services. And it was very strange. And I said, why? And they said, you see, Church Slavonic is not that easy to understand, especially to the person who just come to the church. And we think that we understand, but at the end of the service, we don't. But English is not our language. It doesn't sound familiar. We need to think and pay attention to what's going on. So English service becomes more beneficial because we're forced to pay attention. We are not under the delusion that we understand, but in reality we don't understand. So services in English, curiously enough, to the people who are coming to church consciously, were of greater benefit than services in Church Slavonic. It's a phenomenon that I could, testify as a priest. But overall, of course, we could say that even language for the people who want to come to church is not an obstacle. People
no, it shouldn't be the obstacle.
The
liturgy is the same in 100 languages.
Yes, but it needs to be understood. But of course, the people who are looking for point of contention and conflict, for them anything is conflict. But those people who come, I had plenty of Americans who said, I don't mind church services in Church Slavonic. This is why. Well, we have a book here, just as you said, service is the same. We could look at the book, no problem. And Russians say service in English, well, we live in America, so what's the problem? But those people whose interest in the church is by far more superficial, they would come and say, well, this is not good enough for me, that is not good enough for me. They're looking for pretext not to come or for pretext to have a conflict without understanding. How many people I came like, why do you have American flag? What, you don't like Russia? Put Russian flag in.
Maybe you should put both flags.
Yes, but no, we shouldn't. My position on it, I keep it as a tribute to those people who suffered through those very unfortunate years.
Yeah.
We could not dismiss our past. It's not a political statement. It's statement in a way of martyrdom that those people went to maintain their identity, and their identity was about Christianity for the most part in those very, very challenging years. And even because of political contention, because of variety of other reasons, it's not viewed kindly by some. My position about that is neutral, and I'm coming from a completely different angle. It's about something that, inspires people to pull through. You've been threatened, your life has been threatened for coming to church, right? So this is the reminder. That's also a way of devotion, dedication, not giving up, not dissolving yourself in the local population, but maintaining the most essential part of who you are, your faith.
What do you think about relations between Russian Church in Moscow and yourself in the US? How strong are these ties from the?
Well, American Church is dependent on Russian Church because Moscow granted it autocephaly.
Yeah, of course.
Moscow granted autocephaly, but we have a very peculiar situation here as well, especially in light of recent ecclesiastical conflict in Ukraine.
That's also one of my questions.
Which led to the schism between Constantinople and Moscow. We are too small here. We need to be together with everybody. We could not afford to be divided. We could not afford to choose sides. We whether we like it or not, we are interdependent. We'll cease to exist if we'll start choosing sides. And unfortunately, we're squished between the two. But I don't think that our hierarchs would ever go in open conflict with either or, but definitely not with Moscow, because it's still place of our origin. You don't go against your mother. You may disagree, you may respectfully say so, but you're not going to break the ties. I'm not going to break the ties. So
I will stop here, and we're going to continue with our conversation. It's just the initial talk with you, dear Father Ilya, and we can discuss other issues related to the Russian Orthodox Church, the history of the Church, and the problems not only your parish faces, but other Orthodox churches in diaspora, whether it's a Serbian Orthodox Church or Middle Eastern seats with the faithful who live in the US.
Mm-hmm.
We'll definitely continue. Yeah, we'll definitely continue our conversations, and also I'm available if you want to ask anything about the Middle East and Jordan in particular, Palestine, or so-called Greater Syria, because I don't recognize the current borders. Of course, I have to accept them, but we're talking about the same cultural and historical territory from Mount Taurus in southern Turkey to Sinai Peninsula. And you would be very welcome in Amman if you plan to come, if you plan to come anytime soon after this pandemic. You're more than welcome.
That's number one on my list, to be honest. That's
Thank you
number
so
one
much.
on my list.
No, it's a good that we initiated this conversation. And I have to tell you that from time to time, I follow your podcast and conversations with different clergymen. And maybe next talk will be about relations between different Orthodox churches on the American soil. Sure. Because I'm sure you're very much involved with talks and cooperation with Orthodox churches on the Balkans or from the Middle East. And we're talking about millions of people who are American Arabs or Russian Americans or Serb Americans.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
This is a huge topic that we have to tackle. Thank you so much for your time. All the best.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
God bless.
God bless you. Thank you, Stefan. Hvala.